All right. So welcome back to I'll Read It Eventually. I'm John, and once again, I have read it eventually. And the book in question is Julian the Apostate by GW Bowersock. Not a person that I was familiar with. I say that name like I know who he is. I don't. Um, when this book came out, he was a professor of ancient history at Princeton, which is pretty great. Julian the Apostate is, for those who don't know, one of the more fascinating Roman emperors. And I would say that this book um, does a really good job of telling you all the things you probably need to know about Julian, uh, and then just ending. It ends, I would say, honestly, maybe a little abruptly. Also, ironically, it ends in German, so I don't actually know what the last line says. Because historians who are classically trained can just do that. They just start talking in other languages. Um, I tried to read, this is a tangent, but I tried to read once um, Arnold Toynbee's A Study of History, which is this like massive 15 volume work or something like that. It's huge. Um, in order to make it readable, it had to be condensed like 30 years later into a 3 volume set from the original, 15 or whatever. But Toynbee was this classically trained historian who would just, on a whim, start writing completely in Koine Greek, and then a paragraph later throw in a line of French, and then quote Dante, but in the original Italian, and then have something from Kant, but in the German, um, and then have some Latin verse tossed in as well. So it was impossible for me to read because I don't know any of those languages. I can understand a little bit of Koine Greek if I have some apparatus stuff with me to be like, all right, what does that word mean and that sort of thing. And I know it had a little bit of high school French. So anyway, this book I think really good, sort of I would say standard biography of Julian. You can see it's not very big. This is actually the kind of historical work I would recommend to people who are thinking they might be interested in history but are kind of afraid of picking up, some sort of massive book. Well, something the size of this one. Um, this book is not daunting at all, and it's also, I would say, highly interesting and highly accessible as well. Um, so anyway, it cuts out the chaff. There's 119 pages of text in this book with a couple pages of appendices, um, but you don't even really need to read those in order to get the basic thrust of the life and rule of Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate, in terms of Roman emperors, you have your heavy hitters. You have people like Augustus. You have people like Constantine, Marcus Aurelius, and Trajan and Hadrian. Some of these names that even people who maybe aren't interested in Roman history or ancient history at all, they know some of those names. Julian the Apostate is like the next rung down. He is somebody that people, if you mention his name, people are like, oh, that guy. And some of them might even be able to tell you something about him. But he's sort of in that second tier of emperors that people have probably heard of if they pay attention to discussions of history, but unless they're really interested in it, like I am, probably don't know a ton about him. And so, I can just say like this book was really good. I think it's probably a 4 out of 5 stars. Um, I honestly wish it was a little bit longer, but considering that his life was pretty short and that his rule was very short, there is an argument to be made that there's just not a whole lot to say about him. So um, I'm just going to kind of give you a real quick historical primer on who he is and where he comes from, and basically the story that this book tells about his life and reign. Um, Julian is part of what's known as the Flavian Constantinian dynasty. And what that means is that he is a relative of the Emperor Constantine. Constantine, who, again, probably one of the people that most people, one of the Roman emperors most people know the name of at the very least. Um, and basically what happens is this. In the 3rd century AD, 2nd century AD, late 2nd century AD. Rome is coming off the tail end of probably its best dynasty of emperors, who are called the Antonines, or the five good emperors. The last one, Marcus Aurelius, instead of choosing a successor, he just passes the rule on to his son, Commodus. Commodus, pretty universally agreed to be one of the worst Roman emperors in the entire list of emperors. Just a real disaster. I'll have to read a book about him sometime, and I'll talk about him. He's nuts. Like, actually cuckoo. But anyway, he's assassinated. There's no clear heir to the throne, and so there's in 195 and 196 AD, there's a civil war that's known as the Year of the Five Emperors. The guy who comes out on top of that is a man named Septimius Severus. He starts a pretty short-lived dynasty called the Severan dynasty. He rules, followed by his two sons, who rule jointly for a year before one of them murders the other. The surviving son, Caracalla, rules for, I think, 11 years, something like that. But then he is actually assassinated in a conspiracy because one of his high-ranking military officers thinks that the emperor is going to kill him, and so he hatches a conspiracy to kill the emperor first. And then, weirdly enough, finds himself hailed as emperor by the troops, which some historians actually see as just like the person who wrote that story just being like, oh yeah, he didn't expect that, but it seems to have actually been a coincidence. But anyway, the Severan dynasty has, a rough couple of years there. Eventually, a very young man named Alexander Severus comes to power, and he seems like he's going to be the golden boy and sort of take the Severan dynasty to heights it's never known, and sort of stabilize the Roman Empire after some very wild and crazy years. But in 238, he kind of ticks off his military officers, and one of them, a man named Marcellinus Thrax, starts a rebellion, has himself hailed as emperor by his troops, and then goes to the headquarters where Alexander Severus is staying, and marches in there, and he and his officers murder the emperor and his closest supporters. And the death of Alexander Severus kicks off what's known typically as the crisis of the 3rd century. To put it in short terms, the crisis of the 3rd century is a period of about 50 to 60 years, depending on where you start and where you end. But usually it's about 50 to 60 years, where everything bad that could possibly happen to the Roman Empire happens at the same time. There are numerous foreign invasions. At one point, I think there are 5 separate invasions of Roman territory going on concurrently, like within the same 6-month span. There are, I counted one time, but I think there's something like 2 claimants to the throne per year on average during that 50-year span. And not all of those people are genuine emperors. A lot of them just say, I'm going to be emperor, and then they tick somebody off and they get themselves murdered. But there are that many people who are saying, I have a shot, I'm going to take it, which speaks to the political stability. You've got famine. You've got possibly the first instance of the bubonic plague, or something else, but possibly the bubonic plague, or a really massive epidemic of smallpox. You've got economic stagnation. You've got inflation going on. It's just a mess, and it's all happening together. I taught a class on the Roman Empire once, and I called this period the Omni Crisis, because it's everything all at once. It's just a mess. And so eventually, a group of emperors, soldier emperors from the province of Illyria, which is sort of the non-Italian coast of the Adriatic. The Illyrians are these really hard-bitten soldier emperors who, basically for that entire 50-year period, they and their predecessors are serving in the Roman military and are basically present at every major military engagement and part of every campaign, and they spend their entire lives in the Roman legions. So if you read books about men like Aurelian or Probus or Carus, or eventually Diocletian and Constantius Chlorus, and eventually Constantine as well. All those men, their biographies start off basically by going, oh yeah, this guy was a nobody, but he spent his entire life in the Roman military, joined about the age of 18, appears to have been a foot soldier, was recognized for gallantry and smarts, was promoted multiple times, and eventually found his way to the inner circle of the reigning emperor. And then when that guy died, he was either chosen as the next one by the troops or joined the inner circle of that emperor. And the cycle starts again. And so you have these really hard-bitten soldier emperors who essentially just claw the Roman Empire back from the brink of destruction. Some historians actually argue that when Alexander Severus dies in 238, that's actually the end of the Roman Empire, and you have a totally different state that comes out the other side. I think that's a little bit of a stretch. There's still a very recognizable Roman state, but it does undergo a serious shift. It's a totally different sort of government on the other side. Still the same country or political entity, but with a different method by which it's ruled. But anyway, at the end of the 3rd century, 284, one of these hard-bitten Illyrian emperors by the name of Diocletian comes to power. Diocletian has a bunch of these guys around him, a bunch of these hard-bitten Illyrians, and also other people, but Illyrians, preponderantly Illyrians. And he gathers all these guys together, and he basically says, no more of this, right? And there are a couple other emperors who precede him, who sort of set the stage for this, particularly who I would say is maybe one of the best Roman emperors ever, which is the Emperor Aurelian. I have a book about Aurelian, now that I think about it, so I'll have to read that, and then I can talk about Aurelian. But anyway, Diocletian comes to power, and basically he finishes off all the wars. Several of them had already been won, but he finishes off all the wars. He's very hard on pretenders to the throne. He executes people at the drop of a hat. If he thinks they're disloyal, he just chops off their heads. So puts paid to that. There's a huge amount of economic reforms that he makes. He essentially tries to fix the price of everything in the empire, or at least all major commodities. He creates a unit of universal exchange, because remember, this is basically a barter economy. There's some money, but a lot of people are working with barter within that economy, and so he creates a objective universal exchange unit that people can use to both buy and sell, but also to pay their taxes, which is just wild. And then he also tries to reissue coinage so that the coins aren't just like total crap, because people were clipping the edges and diluting the amount of actual precious metals in the coins for like a century and a half before he became emperor. But anyway, he solves all these problems. And one of the things that Diocletian is probably the most famous for is setting up this method of rule called, by later historians, the Tetrarchy, which consists of himself and another guy named Maximian, and they're what are called the Augusti, so they're the senior co-emperors. Diocletian is very much acknowledged to be the senior most, but they're technically equals. And then both of them have a junior co-emperor, which is called a Caesar. And one of those Caesars, the Caesar in the western half of the Roman Empire, is a man named Constantius Chlorus. And the Tetrarchy goes through all these different iterations. There's a bunch of people involved. Doesn't really matter for the purposes of this. But basically the idea is the two senior guys are emperor together until they die or retire, which is what Diocletian does and what Maximian is supposed to do. And then their Caesars are promoted, and they pick another guy to be their Caesars until they die or retire. And that would perpetuate stable rule, but also give multiple people the opportunity to be emperor, which is what all these pretenders and claimants were wanting anyway. It's just the opportunity to be emperor. So, seemed like it would work. If you read the history of the period, what you find out is it actually just creates multiple competing power bases, and it's a great way to cause a really destructive civil war. But cool in theory. Anyway, one of these co-emperors, junior co-emperors, is a man named Constantius Chlorus. Constantius Chlorus has a son, Constantine. Constantine is his son by his first wife. Constantius Chlorus will marry a second time and have other children with that woman, a lot of other children with that woman. And then Constantine, when he becomes emperor, will do the same thing. And so ultimately, you get this massive family tree, and Constantius Chlorus is Flavius Constantius Chlorus is, I think, his full name. Well, it's not his full name; it's part of his full name. But anyway, the family is often called either the Flavian dynasty, which is a little confusing because there's another Flavian dynasty, or I usually call them the Flavian Constantinian dynasty. And the Flavian Constantinian dynasty has all these male heirs, right? I mean, there's like a dozen men within the family tree. You've got Constantine, his father's brother, so his uncle has a bunch of kids, and so he's got a bunch of cousins and nephews and those sorts of things. He's got several sons himself. This is maddening. So Constantine has his first son, Crispus, which is really well differentiated from Constantine. But then he has three other sons who are named Constantine, Constantius, and Constans. It makes talking about this time period horrible if you're talking about them. Fortunately, I'm not. But you've got all these people within the family tree. And so Julian, the Apostate, eventually the Emperor Julian the Apostate, is a member of that family tree. And basically, what happens is that Constantine is emperor for a very long period of time. He's a very important guy. But ultimately, he passes away. And when he passes away, he splits the empire between his three surviving sons, which are those three that are Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans. And they immediately fall to fighting a civil war with each other. But then there are also all of these other people who are related, all these other men who are related to them, but are not in the direct line of descent. Julian is the son of one of Constantine's daughters. So he's a grandson of Constantine I, but through the female line. Okay? Which means he's not in any sense, especially in a Roman world, he's not in any sense in line for anything, right? He's a prince of the blood, but only kind of, and so can expect to spend his entire life just sort of living on the fringes of power, maybe serving in the army at the behest of his cousins or whatever. But he's never going to be the guy. He's never going to be in charge. But Constantine's sons don't do what Constantine hoped they would do. What he hoped they would do is get along with each other. Instead, they immediately fall to fighting with one another. And so there's a three-way civil war that, is off again, on again for a long period of time. But eventually, one man comes out on top, and that is Constantius II. And one of the first things that Constantius II does when he becomes emperor, so he buries his father. He's the son that buries Constantine in the city of Constantinople. And one of the first things that he does in order to secure his power base is something that is known as the Massacre of the Princes. Something like a dozen members of the extended Flavian Constantinian family he has put to death in like a 12-day span. Just kills them all, right? He has his uncle murdered. He has multiple of his cousins murdered. He has several of his nephews murdered. Essentially, the only people he doesn't kill who are male and members of his family, at least right off the bat, are his two brothers, who he can't get a hold of, and then his two very young nephews, Gallus and Julian. Gallus and Julian are not murdered because they are children at the time. I think they're like 6 and 4 or something like that. So, I mean, they're children. They're really young children. And so even though in Roman imperial politics, children of that age are not exempted from, dynastic murders, essentially, I think Constantius was thinking to himself, I don't have any sons yet. So if I need an heir, I can have one of these guys, and it's good to have a spare. So, heir and a spare. That's basically, as a Roman emperor, what you want, is an heir and a spare. So, Constantius II eventually gets both of his brothers killed and is sort of sole ruler of the Roman Empire, which is not a recipe for success. It's this massive land mass. It's got multiple porous borders that are being attacked by Germanic barbarians and Eurasian barbarians and Persian. Well, they're not even really barbarians in the Roman mind. It's just another empire. But there's all these fires to put out. There are pretenders to the throne, all these things. And so Constantius eventually decides that he does in fact need a co-emperor. That was sort of the standard throughout the 3rd century and into the 4th, is to have co-emperors, right? Diocletian had 3 co-emperors, right? And that was sort of his method. And so Constantius elevates Gallus, who's Julian's half brother, I think. I forget what their exact relationship is. Doesn't matter. They're related. Gallus is put in charge in the city of Antioch in the east, while Constantius is dealing with stuff in the west. And then he hears that Gallus is sort of doing a really bad job, and so he has Gallus executed. And that paves the way for Julian to become emperor. And so he elevates Julian to be his junior co-emperor, so Caesar, to his Augustus. And Julian did not get the typical education that you would get if you were going to be an imperial heir. So he would have, at this point, he's in his 20s. At that point, if you were expected to be the heir to the Roman Empire, you would have seen military service. You would have helped in drafting and passing laws. You would have helped in drafting them because you just stamped them as the emperor. But you would have helped draft laws. You would have sat in judgment in criminal cases and all other sorts of legal cases. You would have been cultivating a network of informants and spies and military officers and important aristocrats and people with money. I mean, you would have been doing all the things that a ruler does, because that was the intent, is that you become the ruler. Julian was never intended to be the ruler. Constantius was trying to have children. We know that he was trying to have kids. Just wasn't working. I believe his wife died in childbirth, and then he just didn't remarry before his own death. And so we know he was intent on having kids, but was not having kids. And so Julian grew up, first of all, in captivity, because Constantius was like keeping him in essentially a prison cell. I mean, it was an estate, but it's a prison. And then after his half brother Gallus is elevated, Julian basically gets to go to like high class boarding school, and so he's getting educated. Particularly, what he's getting educated in is Constantius's version of Christianity, which is Arianism, which is a heresy from Orthodoxy. But then he also starts reading the pagan classics, right? Greek mythology and Roman mythology. And those in particular have a massive influence on him. By the time that he is a grown man, most historians would say, and Bowersock says in his book, Julian had converted from Christianity, which had kind of taken over the empire in the time of Constantine, had converted from Christianity, in which he was raised, to Greco-Roman paganism. So he was actually an avowed pagan, not just like culturally a pagan, but like believed in the gods, wanted to worship using sacrifice, which was illegal at the time. So he was a committed pagan. And eventually, because he's elevated to be co-emperor, he is placed in the western half of the empire. So he's sent to Gaul, modern France, and basically Constantius wants him to do 2 things: stay out of trouble, which means don't rebel against me, and then secondly, he wants him to fight all the Germans. The Germans are flooding across the Rhine River, they're pushing on the Danube River, and there are all sorts of other people groups. The Franks, the Saxons, those people groups are beginning to sort of flow from the eastern part of Eurasia into Western Europe, and so Julian is there with an army, several armies actually, and he's just supposed to sort of fight these barbarians and drive them back across the Rhine and preserve that part of the Roman Empire. Gaul is one of the heartlands of the empire at that stage in history, and it's also highly threatened, and Britain as well. He's supposed to take care of Britain, although he never actually goes there. But anyway, he has for a guy who's never fought an actual battle or been trained to fight battles, the only thing he'd done is read Plutarch's Lives, and then books about Alexander the Great. And so his entire knowledge of battle is theoretical. He's read books about it, right? And then he's put in charge of multiple Roman legions and told to go and fight these hard-bitten Germans who essentially have very little to lose because they're coming from a place that is heavily overcrowded and they don't have their own land. And they're coming into the empire to get riches and potentially take the land, right? And so he's fighting a very wily, very experienced enemy with basically no experience himself. And contrary to effectively all expectation, Julian shines. His ability to translate theory into practice, I would say, is unmatched in Roman emperors. There are plenty of Roman emperors who, again, come up in the school of war and are very good at applying what they learn in the school of war. Julian goes to high-class boarding schools. He's a philosopher. He is not a soldier in any sense of the word when he becomes an emperor or co-emperor, but he shines in Gaul. He fights a number of engagements with the Germans, both on his own and then in concert with some other Roman armies that are maneuvering together with him. In particular, he fights a battle outside the city of Strasbourg, where I think he has 13,000 Roman troops and like barbarian auxiliaries. Half those guys are probably actually Germans themselves, but he has about 13,000 men fighting under his standard, facing off against a little over 2 times that number of Germans who have raided across the Rhine and are kind of pillaging and burning and taking captives and loot and all this sort of stuff. And they're ready to wipe out a Roman army because that's a lot of loot. And contrary, again, to expectations, Julian is able to not just defeat them, but nearly wipe them out. Something like, and in antiquity, this is a lot, something like 6,000 casualties on the field, Germans killed in battle, and that's not including the ones he captures after, or basically we'll never see again because they run so far away. So just an utter victory. Strasbourg is just a huge feather in his cap, and that happens in 357 AD. And so he starts to have a lot of success in Gaul, and his uncle is looking at him and saying, I don't like that. I sent you there effectively to be out of the way and maybe to fail a little bit so you look bad and people would like me. But Constantius can't deal with that because Constantius is off in the east fighting the Persians. And he sends to Julian and he says, hey, buddy, great job killing all those Germans. I need you to send me a third of your armies now. All your best troops, send them to me to fight the Persians. And there are a number of varying interpretations of this, but ultimately, it seems that Julian was interested in becoming the senior emperor, and his troops didn't want to leave Gaul, and so they took this opportunity to basically say, hey, if you'll allow us to declare you emperor, we'll do that so long as we don't have to leave Gaul except to confirm you as emperor, right? So we won't go fight in Persia, but we'll certainly fight to make you emperor. And so his troops spontaneously hail him as an Augustus. And he sends this letter to his uncle where he's like, oh, this is such a misunderstanding, and I didn't mean for this to happen. And they're really, they just love me. It's great. Which is all just nonsense. He knew what he was doing. But anyway, ultimately, Constantius calls his bluff. Julian is forced to make this real quick march to go and face Constantius in 360. And it looks like they're shaping up to have yet another round of civil war between Flavian Constantinian relatives. And then Constantius just dies. He's just passing through Asia Minor, and he just dies. And Julian's like gearing up to fight a battle outside Constantinople, and then some high-ranking military officers from Constantius's army come and they, ask to come into his presence, and they're disarmed, and they come in there, and he's thinking they're going to try and like knife him or something. And they're like, "Hail Caesar." And they tell him that Constantius is dead. So he becomes the undisputed master of the Roman world in 361 AD. And he's basically got like three big aims. First of all, there's a massive number of people working for the Roman government who don't really contribute very much, and he just fires like 80% of them. He just says, "You don't do anything, get out of here." There's a very famous scene where he asks a guy to come and cut his hair, and the guy comes in, the barber, and he's dressed better than Julian, and he has like a dozen attendants. And Julian's like, "What? Why do you have all these people here? If they're going to cut my hair, what good are you?" And so he fires that guy on the spot and then basically gives his job to one of the attendants who actually cuts hair and shaves people, and fires all the other guys too. So that's one of his big things, is just let's slim down this bureaucracy. Let's get rid of all this chaff, all these extra people, kind of like Bowersock did with this book. Let's get rid of all the extra pages. Um, and then the other thing, one of the other big things, the second big thing, is to restore the authority of local city councils, because again, he's the only emperor at this point. Julian is famously not interested in women. He's also not interested in men. He's just completely celibate, at least according to him and his friends. And so he is basically there to say, "I'm going to be the only emperor until I pick somebody to help me." So all these local town councils need to be beefed up and actually do some ruling, because I can't do it all myself. The bureaucracy thing, that actually works. Fixing the local authority thing, that never really works. And then the reason that he is called the Apostate is because when he becomes sole emperor, he publicly declares that he's a pagan. And he begins offering sacrifices to Zeus and the other Greco-Roman gods, and does it very openly, and basically says, "This is going to be our policy as a government." Rome had been primarily Christian. It wasn't the official religion, but it had been the primary religion of the Flavian Constantinian family from the time of Constantine until Julian came to power in 361. And so this is an attempt to go back to the original Roman status quo. The Romans had been, obviously pagans from the beginning, Greco-Roman pagans from the beginning. And so he famously kicks off this part of his reign by reintroducing pagan sacrifice, making it legal to do pagan sacrifice, and then a generalized amnesty. So he says anybody of any religion is allowed to come back from any kind of exile. Nobody can persecute anybody because of their religion. So everybody come back. And, what this means is, it sounds nice on its face, but what it means is you have all the different kinds of Christians, and they're all now allowed to hang out, and they're going to argue with one another, which in Julian's mind means, hey, they're going to make Christianity look terrible, which will make Greco-Roman paganism look really good. And so he takes what works for Christianity socioculturally and tries to make it happen in Greco-Roman paganism. So he standardizes the way that the clergy in Greco-Roman paganism works. He gives them, ways in which they're supposed to behave. And then he basically starts state-sponsored pagan charities so that they can sort of outspend the Christians. None of this ever actually works. And in my view, it's unlikely that he would have been able to make paganism stick. A lot of people had converted to Christianity in actuality, not just because it was convenient politically, but really. And paganism had gone out of fashion. Even at that point in time, his sort of old style of Greco-Roman paganism was not the thing that people wanted to practice. People wanted to practice what are called mystery religions, which are pagan religions, but that offer salvation as a part of their theology and a part of their practice. People did not want the kind of religion that Julian was selling, and so I don't think it would have worked ultimately. But he turns his back on Christianity because he was raised as a Christian. He was publicly a Christian until he became emperor, And so he is known to history as the Apostate, or basically the former Christian who turned on it. He only rules for a year and a half by himself, but by the time he's done, he's basically begun to persecute Christians. He starts confiscating their property and things like that. So eventually, I think that's where he would have gotten to, is in order to replace Christianity with paganism, you'd have to stop having Christians, which means either you stop making Christians, which is hard to do. They made a ton of Christians, even while Roman emperors were persecuting them to death. So unlikely that he would have been able to do the destruction of the entire religion without killing people. Or you have to just make everybody want to be a pagan, which is hard to do when being a pagan means, hey, kill all those people that aren't like us. It's a hard ask. So, he's also famously prickly, so his ideas, even if they were good, he would say them in a way that people would hate. That's what he does. He goes to Antioch because he has to go fight the Persians. And in Antioch, he kicks off every community, including the pagans. He makes the Christians mad because he's a pagan. He makes the populace mad because he's heavy-handed and he calls them silly. They make him mad because they make fun of his beard, because quite famously he has a beard. He has a beard. Most Roman emperors did not have beards, really ever, but certainly at this stage in history, most of them did not wear a beard. But he wears it because he really loves Greek culture and because he thinks of himself as a philosopher. And this is what Julian himself is reputed to have written about what kind of person he thought philosophers should be. He who enters upon the career of a cynic, which is a type of philosopher, ought first to censure severely and cross-examine himself, and without any self-flattery ask himself the following questions in precise terms: whether he enjoys expensive food, whether he cannot do without a soft bed, whether he is the slave of rewards in the opinion of men. So Julian basically thinks he's better than everybody. He's like, yeah, he thinks he's better than everybody. He's one of those people that is a vegetarian and can't wait to tell you that he's a vegetarian and brings it up in every possible case. He, as I said earlier, doesn't sleep with people. He doesn't have sex ever. At least not that his very close friends who are with him all the time are willing to admit to. He says as much himself in his writings. He sleeps on a straw bed. He doesn't have he fires people outright who have more attendance than he does. He just says, "Yeah, get out of here." So he is very much into the simplicity, and he thinks that anybody who's not into simplicity of style and dress and mode of living, you're just too much, you're too extra, and you need to be fired. And you can't do that at an imperial scale, and he tries to do it at an imperial scale. So eventually he gets into like a back and forth, a written back and forth with the people of Antioch. They start writing basically what the equivalent of like bad op-eds in the newspaper against him, and then he proceeds to write a whole book where he makes fun of them, called The Beard Hater, which is a reference to himself. But he has to stop all these extracurriculars because the Persians are invading, and so he mounts an invasion of Persia in 363. And it sees a little bit of initial success, but ultimately is kind of caught flat-footed, probably misled by some local sources as to where the enemy army is and what they're going to do and what he should do, and ultimately is forced to retreat. And when he goes into retreat, the Persians pounce, and they're just cutting his column to pieces, right? There's a Roman historian by the name of Ammianus Marcellinus, and Marcellinus was a participant in this campaign. He's a first-hand eyewitness to this campaign and participated in the battles, multiple battles that took place in this retreat. And the Persians would just send, massed columns of elephants and armored cavalry and horse archers and all of these fast-moving, scary things to attack the Roman column, which is primarily infantry. Really slow-moving, very thin, and just, slapping them around the desert, basically, as they're frantically trying to get back to Roman territory. And ultimately, during one of those attacks, Julian hears the alarm, rushes out of his tent without putting on his breastplate, his cuirass. And during the combat, Bowersock actually makes the claim. I've never heard this before, but he makes the claim that the evidence substantiates that a Persian auxiliary, who's an Arab, throws a spear that pierces his side, and that is the weapon that ultimately causes his death. Obviously, because he has all these conflicts with Christians, the people who loved Julian would later claim that a Roman Christian killed him, right? So like one of his own soldiers basically stabbed him in the midst of the melee. Bowersock says, nope, it was Persian, and I forget which historical source he quotes to prove that, but basically says that it's indisputable. So I'll have to look into that. I don't know if that's really true or not, but he claims that it's straight up not a Christian. It's this guy. There's also a legend that grows up that actually a Christian saint who was already dead comes back from the dead to kill Julian, which is a pretty wild hypothesis. I believe that's Saint Mercurius, who's believed to have done that, but obviously that's not a thing. And so ultimately he dies. He's depicted by his friends as dying in the same way Socrates does. So he's like holding court in his bed as he's like bleeding out from this spear wound over the course of a day. And he's talking about how it's great to die as a philosopher and all. It's nonsense. I think he's stabbed in it's a pretty severe wound, and it's in a pretty important place. It's in his side underneath the rib cage, which is where they stabbed Jesus to make sure that he was dead. So he's probably not conscious for a lot of this. He's probably delirious, and so he ultimately expires, and the army's forced to choose a new emperor in the midst of the desert. Bowersock doesn't even tell you that. He just says Julian dies, and then he says something in German that I don't understand, and then the book ends, which is fine. I mean, his book is Julian the Apostate, and Julian's dead at that point, so what else is there to say? The one thing that was missing from this book, and I'm really pushing my time here. The one thing that was missing from this book, I think, is just a conclusion. It does not have a conclusion. It just ends with his death, and again, gives one parting note in a language I don't speak or understand. So I'll have to look up what it means. Maybe I'll post it as a comment beneath the video. But anyway, modern scholars will often point to Julian and say, hey, this guy was going to be great. This guy was going to be the next Constantine, but for paganism. This guy was going to be the next Marcus Aurelius, because Marcus Aurelius, very famous philosopher, emperor, who's also highly successful. I don't think that's true. In my view, Julian was too much of a pain in the butt to ultimately have become that great of a man. Constantine knew how to ingratiate himself with people, which is why even as he was, in his old age, he was loved both by Christians who claimed him as a Christian, even though he hadn't yet been baptized, and loved by people who worshipped Sol Invictus, pagans, who said, oh yeah, he's one of us, right? Constantine was able to hold those two groups together and win a massive civil war with 5 other claimants to the throne of the Roman Empire. He was able to come out on top because he was able to create and maintain the largest power base of all these different competing groups of people. Julian couldn't do that. Julian became emperor because there was nobody else. Constantine became emperor because he killed everyone else. And everybody loved him anyway. And honestly, as far as Marcus Aurelius goes, yeah, Julian's a philosopher too. He wrote voluminously. He's one of the emperors, one of the figures from classical antiquity by whom we have the most writings that still survive. There's like 2 whole books of his, and then a bunch of letters and a bunch of poetry and some other stuff. So, it's just an enormous amount of writing compared to some of these other figures. Aurelius has 1 book, which is the Meditations. I think Julian was much more philosopher than he was emperor, And I think even when he became emperor, he wanted to stay a philosopher. Aurelius talks about in the Meditations the fact that what he wants to do is to be a philosopher, but what he needs to do is be emperor and be a good one. And that's actually like, that is what his philosophy is. He's a Stoic, and Stoicism is all about duty. Basically, the universe doesn't care about you. So the best thing that you can possibly do is simply fulfill your duty as you understand it and live well. And that's what Aurelius does. Um, Julian, on the other hand, is just getting into these like intramural fights with the people of Antioch or Christians or whoever. And I honestly just don't think that there's a universe in which he survives this horrible invasion of Persia, which he was losing. Okay? It's a military campaign. It would have been a defeat. It was a defeat, but it would have been a worse defeat even if he'd survived. I think if he gets back to Roman territory, his officers, who might already have been conspiring to kill him, there was one conspiracy that he figured out before they tried to launch it, and he killed the person who was responsible. That was going to happen again. And I guarantee you, if that conspiracy didn't get him, the next one would have. And Julian would be another one of those bright stars that burns bright but fizzles fast in the history of the Roman Empire. There are dozens of them, and I think he would still, honestly, I think he is a footnote to Roman history, but I think he would still be a footnote to Roman history, even if he lived and died 2 years later at the end of an assassin's knife or to poison or whatever. I think he wouldn't have accomplished much of anything. Um, as I said, he would have been forced to persecute Christians at a large scale and quite violently, I think, to end the supremacy of Christianity in the Roman Empire. I think it had been entrenched over about half a century by the time he comes to power. It's hard to turn back the clock on that, especially when you are a pain in the butt, and that's all you are. Um, he might have been able to produce a Greco-Roman paganism that competed with Christianity, but honestly, Christianity became so dominant because it overcame a competitor Greco-Roman paganism. So I don't think that Julian was bright enough and smart enough and strong-willed enough and successful enough to create Greco-Roman paganism anew to overcome Christianity. I think at that point, Christianity had demonstrated it was going to be the primary socio-political force in the Roman Empire, and that was because it overcame all the other systems and would continue to for, well, really until modernity. So there's that. Altogether, really good book. Highly recommend this book to anybody who's interested in Roman history. As I said, super readable, super small. And you don't have to know all of the background that I just gave you in order to read it. But of course, if you're still watching, then I guess you do know all the background now, or at least can get it. And as much as I think he's a pain in the butt, he's also fascinating. So, highly recommend Julian the Apostate by GW Bowersock. This video is way longer than I expected it to be already, so I'm going to stop talking and move along. So, that's all I got. Go read something.